Yeah.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Mar. You get the A for the day. Sid gets the D for showing up. I will say, Sid, your attendance is now exceeds some of the people that were nominally in our class from the first day. So good job.
Thank you.
Almost as if coming to class matters. All right. Yeah, right, Hannah? All right. Hey, Chester. Glad you could make it. See if anybody else. All right. Okay. So I believe where we stopped last class was the job search theory of unemployment. So let's go back there just to remind ourselves what's going on. So, okay, here was the basic model. We said there is a reservation wage curve. Each worker has one. It starts high and it declines as your period of unemployment goes up. Similarly, the WO is the wage offer curve. It's the cumulative probability of finding a wage offer of a given level, right? It is possible that you would find this wage offer the first day you look for a job, but it's unlikely, right? So the longer you look, the more likely you are to find a higher wage offer. Okay, and so what we said is, in the model, you search until you find a job offer that meets your reservation wage, and then you take it. And so this graph determines the average duration of unemployment in the labor market. And I said the average duration is positively correlated with the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, and no, let me say that a little bit differently. The duration is positively correlated with the actual rate of unemployment wherever you happen to be on the curve. Okay, so then what we said is we talked about how, as a result of the economy expanding, you move up the Phillips curve, and what that does is it creates a situation where people are taking jobs too early. They think they just got lucky. They don't realize that wage offer curves have gone up. And when they do realize that, then they ask for more money, and so their reservation wage curves go up, and this is what it looks like. Okay, so you start at A and little a. An expansionary monetary fiscal policy pushes us up to B. And then when people realize what's going on and they ask for more money, they go to little c and big C as the Phillips curve shifts. Another expansionary policy will move us up to D and move us up to D. But the only way that employers can keep fooling workers is if the inflation rate accelerates, so that workers' expectations always lag behind and they don't catch up. At some point, the inflation rate gets so high so that people care more about inflation than they do unemployment, and the process reverses. Okay, now the punchline. The punchline is, this is what it looks like in the long run. In the long run, you can't get off this vertical average duration of unemployment, and we discover that in the long run, the Phillips curve is vertical. There is no trade-off. Any trade-off only is temporary. Okay, any questions about that? That didn't work. Okay, hearing no Hearing no questions. So this is the expectations-augmented Phillips curve, okay, which is the result of the job search theory here, okay? So let me show you. The original Phillips curve was the inflation rate is negatively related to the unemployment rate. The expectations-augmented Phillips curve takes that a step further in two ways. The first thing that it looks at is, instead of looking at just the plain unemployment rate, what it looks at is the unemployment gap here, the difference between the actual unemployment rate and the natural rate of unemployment. So what the expectations augmented theory says is it's the difference in the unemployment rates, the unemployment gap, which is actually going to cause prices to rise. The second thing, and the thing that gives the expectations-augmented Phillips curve its name, is we also incorporate inflationary expectations. Okay, so this is the expected rate of inflation today. If you had to guess what the expected rate of inflation today is, what would you say? What do people imagine? People who are not economics students or economists probably imagine the inflation rate is.
It's like 2%.
Ah, you're speaking as an economist. Okay, if you asked your parents what the inflation rate is, and I'm assuming your parents aren't economists, my guess is that they would say inflation is probably pretty close to zero because it's not a big deal. We don't notice it very much, right? So we are in a non-inflationary environment, which is nice because it means that this last term here doesn't really matter very much. Not right now, not with inflationary expectations close to zero. All right. Next, what we want to do is we want to take it a step further, and we want to derive, actually, it's not much of a derivation. We want to look at the modern expectation-augmented Phillips curve. And to do that, we need to incorporate a supply shock, or the possibility of supply shocks. Sometimes these are called price shocks. Here is a definition. It's a little bit different than the one that I gave you at the beginning of this discussion. A supply shock is an unexpected event that suddenly changes the supply of a product, or in a macro sense, suddenly changes GDP, resulting in an unanticipated change in price. So let me repeat that. A supply shock is an unexpected event that suddenly changes GDP, resulting in an unanticipated change in the price level.
Can you say that one more time?
An unexpected event that suddenly changes GDP, resulting in an unanticipated change in the price level. Okay, so the best example of that is a significant change in oil prices, because petroleum is used in the production of nearly everything in a modern economy. Certainly every product requires energy, whether it's electrical energy or a generator, and that energy comes, at least in part, from burning oil. In addition, petroleum products are used in the production of plastics, and petroleum also is used widely in the production of fertilizers. So we may not think of oil as a key input in growing corn and wheat, but it turns out that it is. Okay, so So if we say every product requires petroleum, and if the price of petroleum goes up, say 25%, then that means overnight, everything is going to become significantly more expensive because of that cost increase. Okay, I noted that yesterday, I don't know if you're familiar with what's going on in the oil market right now, but because of the worldwide decrease in economic activity, there's been a significant decrease in the demand for oil worldwide, and that's brought prices down. And so that has upset OPEC and also Russia, which is a major oil exporter. So Russia and OPEC, specifically the Soviet Union, are having a fight about who should reduce oil production more to bring the price back up. And they haven't been able to come to an agreement. Okay, so yes, I believe it was yesterday, our brilliant president announced that Russia and Saudi Arabia had come to an agreement, and that was going to boost oil prices. And wasn't that great for American oil producers? Okay. Now, there's two problems with that statement. One is it may be good for oil producers, but it means the rest of us are going to take a cost hit because we're going to have to spend more money on gasoline and fuel and stuff like that. But apparently, he's not thinking about consumers. Go figure. Okay. And then the other thing is, shortly after he made that announcement, a spokesman from Putin, President Putin in Russia, said, hey, there was no such agreement. So apparently I don't know what, he made it up or thought it would be a good story or something. Okay. Anyway, it's still a good example of a supply shock. Okay. Now, supply shocks can be negative, but they can also be positive. Okay. We know that in 1974, there was this massive Arab oil embargo that increased prices, I mean, more than you can even imagine. They went up by a factor of 40 or something like that, okay? I mean, oil prices went from like $4 a barrel to $80 a barrel. You can calculate the percent increase, but the number's so large, it's just crazy. Okay, so that caused a major hit to economies worldwide in the mid-1970s. The US experienced what at the time was the largest post-World War II recession in 74 and 75, and that was as a result of the oil crisis. But in the early 1980s, oil prices came significantly back down, and that was a positive supply shock. And so, that undid much of the harm that the OPEC oil embargo did to the economy. So again, supply shocks can go either way, okay? Especially when you're talking about commodity prices like oil, which tend to be fairly volatile from time to time. Okay, unfortunately, well, anyway, I was gonna say, unfortunately, most of the supply shocks that we hear about are of the negative variety. All right. So when we incorporate supply shocks into the story, we get the modern expectations-augmented Phillips curve, which is the augmented Phillips curve with one addition. We're adding rho, the Greek letter rho, which is any supply shocks that are occurring. So rho is defined as negative supply shocks have a positive value of rho. So negative supply shocks like the oil crisis will raise the inflation rate.
Can you explain rho again?
Rho is just just a number. it could be it could range from -1 to +1. When there's no supply shock, rho has a value of 0, so there's nothing there. But a negative supply shock has a positive rho value. A positive supply shock has a negative rho value. So when there's a negative supply shock, rho is positive. And if you look at the equation there, Sid, what you'll see is it raises the inflation rate on the left-hand side, right? So an increase in rho raises the inflation rate. A decrease in rho lowers the inflation rate.
Thank you.
So an increase in oil prices, say, would raise the inflation rate. A decrease in oil prices would lower the inflation rate.
When was the final addition for supply shocks made to the equation? Is that like, how recent is that?
Probably, let's see. I want to say the 90s. And the reason why is because this equation was basically developed in the 80s, and then they added supply shocks to it. So notice also that what a supply shock does is it shifts the Phillips curve. Just like inflationary expectations shift the Phillips curve, supply shock shifts the Phillips curve. Other questions? We're going to get into some serious algebra next with Greek letters. Don't let the Greek letters confuse you. So Sid, if you're confused by beta or alpha, just think of them as A and B.
Thank you.
Much less confusing that way, maybe. Okay, that was a joke, everybody, in case you were wondering. All right, now, who wants a question here? Let me look for a volunteer. Aspen, drinking out of that big water bottle. Aspen, what is the relationship between employment and GDP? Positive or negative?
Positive.
Yes. Okay. So the higher the GDP, the higher employment, and the lower the unemployment, right? So the relationship between output and unemployment is going to be negative. All right. Okay. Let's look at Okun's law. Okun's law, well, Okun's law looks at the question that I just asked Aspen, but instead of asking whether it's a positive or a negative relationship, Okun asked how big. What is the coefficient? Okay. Arthur Okun was a really bright macroeconomist, but in addition to being bright, he was particularly good at explaining complex economic issues in ways that ordinary people could understand. He used a lot of metaphors. Anyway, Okun's law said, and this was actually based on regression analysis, for every percentage point that GDP rises above potential, the unemployment rate falls 0.5 percentage point below the natural rate. Now I have that on a slide to make it easier for you. Okay. The unemployment gap is half the output gap. So when unemployment rises 1%, no, let me say it the other way. When GDP rises 1% above potential, unemployment falls 0.5% below the natural rate. Okay, so it's basically a 2-to-1 relationship. Did anyone hear the unemployment figures announced this morning? Shocking, you guys. You should be paying attention to this stuff.
4% or was it
100,000 people
6%?
lost their jobs.
No, the unemployment rate rose to 4.4% from 3.5%, so it increased by 0.9, almost a whole percentage point. Okay. Now, that is an underestimate of what's going on because that unemployment rate is based on a survey that was done 3 weeks ago. Okay, so economists are expecting the unemployment rate to go up to probably 8% over the next month or two. You know, that will be like the fastest rise in the unemployment rate in a very, very long time. Okay, so just looking at Okun's law here, if the unemployment rate rose by 1%, what does that imply about GDP falling?
Should fall by 2%.
Yeah, a 2% fall in GDP in a month. That's really, really, really big.
So why is it not a 1-to-1 ratio?
That is a great question. Okay, what now? Why intuitively would we think it's 1-to-1?
Well, because like I would kind of assume that 1% of the population of like the working class would provide 1% of GDP. So then raising
So
employment would.
what does that say about the marginal product of labor? Isn't that saying something about the marginal product of labor? Or if you think in terms of a production function, right? A 1% increase in employment, you're thinking should translate into a 1% increase in GDP?
Yeah.
Maybe, but what about the other factors of production? They would probably have to increase by the same amount too to get that. So part of the reason why this isn't 1-to-1 is because this doesn't say anything about labor or sorry, about capital or technology, which may or may not be increasing. Okay. The other reason has to do with flaws in the unemployment statistics. If you leave the labor force, you're not counted at all, right? So if you're laid off, say, and you don't look for a new job, then you don't count. And so that's a flaw in the measurement here, right? Another thing is, suppose instead of being laid off, you have your hours cut by half. Output falls by half.
But you're not unemployed.
But you're not unemployed, see? So there are all these little things in here, okay? Also, another thing that you should worry about, think about, is this was a study done in the 70s, okay? And more recent studies have found slightly different numbers. So the number varies, okay? But there's still a relationship there. That's the most important thing.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? All right. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take Okun's law here, and we're going to plug it into the modern Phillips curve right here. Okay, so what we're going to do, and I'll show you on this slide, is we're going to take the unemployment gap, which is part of the Phillips curve, and transform it into the output gap by using Okun's law. So we take this right here, this is on the right-hand side, and we plug it in right here. And when we do that, we get this equation, okay, which, to simplify a little bit, I turned into this equation right underneath, where this pitchforky thing is just 0.5 times the chi. The chi is a fraction, 0.5 is a fraction, so the pitchfork is just another fraction. Okay, so we took Okun's law, we substituted it into the Phillips curve, and we ended up with this thing. Anybody have any questions about that? Except for the Greek letters, it's pretty simple algebra. Okay, any questions? I'm going to pull the rabbit out of the hat in a moment, but I want to give you a chance to speak if you have a question. Once again, Quinn's body language is not telling me very much.
I apologize, Dr. Greenlaw.
It's okay, it's a joke. Just trying to keep things light.
I know you are.
All right, now abracadabra. Rachel, what's the rabbit?
I don't know.
Okay, what do we call this curve, right? This equation right here?
Phillips Cur?
No, the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve has unemployment in it, right? The answer is that is the short run aggregate supply curve. This equation is the same equation, by the way, that was on the previous page. I just put it on its own page here. So again, let's think about what this says. This says inflation depends on the output gap, inflationary expectations, and any supply shock. Hannah's getting this, I can tell. Okay, now, what causes an output gap? What causes GDP to differ from potential? What causes unemployment to differ from the natural rate? Because it's the same thing. The answer is a change in aggregate demand. So this term here reflects an aggregate demand shock. So what that tells us is the rate of inflation depends on any aggregate demand shock, any aggregate supply shocks, and inflationary expectations. So even though there's a lot in these equations, it really comes down to a couple of basic points. Would a $1 trillion stimulus package count as an aggregate demand shock? Rob is shaking his head. Why not?
Because money given to the public by the government isn't product.
No, but the question is, what will people do with the money? Will they spend it? If so, that's a demand shock. That, by the way, is the largest demand shock in the history of the US economy. It'll be interesting to see how it's used. Has anybody gotten their check yet? I heard.
Still waiting on mine.
Yeah, good luck with that.
I'm a
I
dependent,
heard.
so I don't get one.
I
Why
don't get
not?
one either.
Yeah, I don't think most of us or any of us qualify.
Why not?
We're
I'm
dependents.
You make too much money?
No, we're dependents, but we're also not under 18, so we also don't get the minor one either.
Oh, darn. Yeah, I know. So the good news is Treasury Secretary Mnuchin announced that the payments would start early next week. That's good news. And then if you read the fine print, it said, but most Americans won't receive payments until September. Good thing we don't need any, spend any money between now and then. All right. Any questions? Okay, good. Now, what does this darn thing look like? Okay, well, let's take a look. The first thing we want to do is we want to use a little simple algebra to reorganize the equation. Okay, so this is the original equation, and here all I'm doing is I'm expanding the output gap, and then separating potential output, the effect on potential output with the effect on GDP. And then I'm collecting some terms, and we end up right here. Okay, so this is what the aggregate supply curve looks like. What does that look like to you? There's two components here. There's the pitchfork, and there's this block of stuff. If you think about this as a straight line, this equation is in the form of y equals b plus mx. What's the b?
The y-intercept.
What's the b? Oh, sorry.
Intercept.
It is the y-intercept, yeah. Okay. What's the m?
Slope.
It is the slope. So this is what our aggregate demand curve looks like. It is upward sloping with a slope of the pitchfork. Okay. What happens if there's a change in inflationary expectations or a change in rho, the supply shock variable, or a change in potential real GDP? What happens to the DAS curve?
It shifts it up or
It
down.
shifts it up or down. Exactly. Why does potential real GDP have a minus sign in front of it?
Because aren't you finding the every time GDP or the extent the GDP goes above the potential GDP?
Now, what we're doing, what's on the left-hand side of this equation is the inflation rate, right? So higher inflationary expectations, a negative supply shock, those make inflation worse. But an increase in potential real GDP is an increase in supply. That's going to bring prices down. That's going to shift the DAS curve down and reduce the rate of inflation. So my point here is all of these things make sense when you think of them individually and when you think of them in terms of the curve here. Any questions? All right, let's jump back to the equation for a minute. In the long run, by definition, there are no supply shocks, so rho is 0. The output gap is 0. What does that say about the shape of the DAS curve? What it says is just like the Phillips curve, the DAS curve is going to be vertical in the long run. But instead of at the natural rate of unemployment on the Phillips curve graph, it's going to be vertical at potential real GDP. So the actual inflation rate could be anywhere along this vertical line. What is the actual inflation rate going to be?
It's going to be equal to the expected.
It's going to be equal to inflationary expectations, exactly, because this term is 0 and this term is 0. So inflation will be equal to people's expectations of it. If people expect no inflation, then the actual inflation rate will be 0. If they expect 10% inflation, the actual inflation rate will be 10%. But any way you look at it, GDP won't have any impact on that. All right, any questions? Jess is excited, I can tell. She's gonna go reread chapter 15. All right, that's all I want to do today. If you haven't read chapter 15, do it by Monday and send me your chapter analysis, okay? Because what we're going to do beginning Monday is derive the DAD curve, much like we did the DAS curve, okay? There are more moving parts in the aggregate demand curve, and so it's going to be a little more complicated, but it's the same basic story that we've done here. Use a little bit of algebra, do some substitutions, and see what we come up with. All right, on that note, have a great weekend, guys.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Take
everyone.
care.
Have a good weekend.
Thanks, Professor.
So I had a question about the bailout that you were talking about before. You were talking about
Bailout? You mean the stimulus package?
the stimulus package, yeah, like how that is a demand shock, but would the bailout
Well, okay,
for
it is an
companies be considered?
increase, Sid, it's an increase, a very large increase in government spending.
Yeah.
Okay. Some of that increase is grants, some of it is loans, some of it is going to be tax cuts, but it's still expansionary fiscal policy.
Okay, yeah, I meant in terms of like people are getting like $1,000 checks, so they're going to spend more with that money.
Right, now that is a transfer payment, right? But when people start spending that money, that will stimulate demand.
No, yeah, I get that. I was talking about like the other side of the stimulus package, like that's directed at companies. Would
Okay.
that be considered a demand shock as well?
Sure,
or is that,
absolutely. Okay,
yeah.
So like, there's a couple ways to look at that. One is some of that money is going to bail out the airline industry, which in my view is a good example of crony capitalism, because the airline industry took their tax cuts from 3 years ago and they used them to buy back stock to make their stockholders richer. And now they have no cash. So if this were truly capitalism, we would say, too bad, so sad, stockholders, you go out, you know, you lose your shirts.
Right.
Okay. So what the industry is saying is, oh, but wait, we're a strategic industry. We're necessary. You can't let us fail. And this is where not understanding how markets work really is a problem, because there is going to be a demand for air travel in the future. And whoever doesn't go bankrupt because they didn't get rid of all their cash, they're going to be able to make a lot of money when we get through this.
Just cut out.
That's the way capitalism is supposed to work. So
You just cut
instead,
out. Can you say that last sentence again?
Sure.
About
Sure.
demand?
So every airline isn't equally in a bad place right now. Some of them held on to cash. And the ones that held on to cash are the ones that aren't going to go bankrupt. So if United goes under, that's terrible for United's workers, and it's unfortunate for United's stockholders, but there's no guarantee when you invest in the stock market that you're going to make money, especially if you got a pile of it back over the last 2 years. The purpose of the tax cuts, according to the administration, was to stimulate investment and create jobs. And most of the airlines didn't do that. They just took the money and they ran with it.
Gotcha.
Okay, so the point is when we get out of the recession, no, let me say it differently. Not bailing out the airline industry means that some airline companies will probably go bankrupt, but not all of them will. And the ones that survive will survive because they were prudent in what they did with their tax cut money. And they will then be in a position to expand to meet the demand. And probably some new entrepreneurs will come in, right? That's the way capitalism is supposed to work. Instead, we're protecting people who made bad business decisions just because they're rich. Okay, that's not capitalism. That's crony capitalism.
Gotcha.
Okay. Anyway, so there.
All right, awesome. Thanks.
Anybody else?
How do you spell crony capitalism?
Can you spell capitalism?
Crony.
Can you spell capitalism?
Can I spell capitalism?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can spell capitalism.
Okay, crony.
Yeah, is it-
C-R-O-N-Y. It means the people with wealth and power have influence on the system so that we live in a situation where if they make good business decisions, they make piles of profits, which is great. But if they make bad business decisions, then they expect taxpayers like you and me to bail them out. That's not the way capitalism is supposed to be. And so it has a name. It's called crony capitalism. Think of it as welfare for capitalists.
Is that an actual term?
That is
Or
an
ju-
actual term.
Oh,
Google.
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. It was originally used to describe what was happening in the Asian financial crisis, but now it can be used to describe the US economy.
It's just rampant corruption in government, right? Like
Yeah,
leaning
it
towards
is.
business.
Yes.
Gotcha.
But consider the president. I mean, look at his business history. He drives companies in the ground and then he runs away and doesn't pay his debts. I mean, why would we expect him to run the country any differently?
Will we be able to go over assignment 6 on Monday?
Yes, we will. So Aspen, what I really wanted to tell you was K-R-O-N-Y, just to mess with you.
I'm not good at spelling. It's not my
That's
strong.
okay. See, in person, you come across as so sweet that I wouldn't dare to do that. Online, you don't come across quite as sweet. And so I felt the urge, but I controlled myself.
Thank you, Professor.
You bet. Anybody else have questions? Well, I have a lot of questions, but they're not entirely relevant to our class.
Like what? What are your questions?
Huh?
What are your questions?
Well, my questions are all about how bad the recession is going to be, how long it's going to last, what is the mechanism by which we are going to go down, And those are all questions that we're going to explore in my Econ 405 class next semester. So you guys should take it.
How long do you think this is going to last?
I could tell you that, but then you wouldn't want to take the class.
I would still want to take the class.
I still want to take the class.
You know me.
Okay, here's what I think. So what I think is, until we get the virus under control, the economy won't be able to restart. It just won't, okay? So this wave of the virus is going to peak over the next month in the US. But then probably next fall, they're anticipating a second wave that won't be as bad, but it's still bad. And then maybe a third wave in the spring. Okay, so each subsequent wave is going to be less serious than the one before because people who got sick and survived will have immunity. So the virus won't spread as easily. But until we get a vaccine, okay, there's always going to be that threat out there. And probably the best guess of when a vaccine will be widely available is about 18 months. And it's at that point that we can restart the economy in a big way. That's my prediction. And
seems legit, yeah.
You know, and here's hoping that we'll have somebody new in the White House by then.
Would you say we're already in the recession?
Absolutely. Yeah.
The MB, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So
how does like the MBER like determine when
okay.
that?
They look at 4 different variables. None of them is GDP. Okay. They look at employment. They look at, I think, retail sales. They look at factory orders. If you go to nber.org, you can see the variables that they look at. And then they make a judgment call about when enough of those are going down that they can say, yeah, this is the real deal. Each of those variables is available monthly. GDP is only available quarterly. So we won't have the first quarter GDP figures until another month, okay, for June, July, or January, February, March. And even those figures will be revised the following month. So the first estimate has a high standard deviation. It's very likely to change. But the second quarter figures are going to be awful. So in August, when we're looking back at April, May, June, okay, it's going to be bad. So be nice to your parents, guys. Sid knows why I'm saying that.
Let them crash in their basement, right?
Yes.
Thanks, Professor.
My kids are actually cooking dinner tonight, so I'm all in favor of that.
You got a nice setup, huh?
Yeah, they're making grilled tuna tacos. So no Kraft mac and cheese for us, guys.
Thank you, Dr. Greenlaw.
Yeah, thank you. See you Monday.
Yep, bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Greenlaw. Have a good weekend.